will be allowed into the Palestinian territory. After coming under increased international pressure to change its policy towards the troubled Strip, the Israeli government last week said it would liberalize the flow of civilian goods, but gave few details.
Well, the representative of the Middle East Diplomatic Quartet and former Prime Minister Tony Blair told our colleague Martin Croxall that Israel was under pressure to change its Gaza policy long before last month's flotilla tragedy.
Well, obviously, I think that the tragic events of a couple of weeks ago have focused everyone's attention. But frankly, this has been going on for a couple of years. I've actually been in discussion with the Israeli government for a long time about changing policy. There was some easing of policy over the last few months, but now we've got an opportunity to do it properly, and we should take that opportunity. And the statement, I've just come from a meeting with the Israeli Prime Minister. The statement that they've issued today allows us to make a significant change. It's got to be implemented, of course, but if it is, it will amount to a significant change in the lives of people of Gaza.
Is this a tacit admission, then, from the Israeli government that their policy towards Gaza and this blockade, I mean, putting aside the flotilla, if you wish, that it's failed?
Well, I think it's this, really, that everybody accepts that Israel has a complete right to protect its security, and it's got to check what comes into Gaza. I mean, the truth is that there is a real security threat to Israel. It's got every right to protect itself against that threat. On the other hand, to have a situation where people in Gaza can't get access to foodstuffs and household items that they need, where we can't rebuild things like water and sanitation and electricity, housing, schools and so on. I mean, this isn't sensible. So today's statement essentially gives us three things. It moves from a situation where only those items on a permitted list, a restricted permitted list, can come into Gaza, to a situation where things come into Gaza as a matter of course, unless they're on a prohibited list, which is essentially about combat material and weapons. Secondly, it allows us to facilitate these United Nations projects for reconstruction in things like schools and hospital and water, sanitation and so on. And the third thing is that it enables us to expand the crossings capacity so that these goods can come in, and also so that we can get an expansion of commercial activity as well. Now, we've got to keep on this and make sure that what is promised is actually done, and that's the task, I think, for the next few weeks. But if this is implemented in the way that we envisage, it will make a big difference.
The United Nations has said specifically, as you've just alluded to, that building material must be allowed in to help with reconstruction of Gaza. Israel's saying yes, but only to a degree, because certain things could be regarded as having a dual use, not just for construction, but potentially for war materials, offensive weapons. Doesn't this, again, give Israel this room for manoeuvre so they can still impose a blockade while having appeared to have liberalised things?
Well, I think and hope we've got a way through this, which is that there's a procedure which the government of Israel and the United Nations, ourselves and others, have been working very closely on, which will allow this material to come in for the designated United Nations and indeed other projects of construction, and make sure that this material actually goes for the use for which it's intended. So we've been kind of testing this out actually over the past few weeks, even before the tragic incident with the flotilla, and I think we can make it work. I hope so, because it's important to remember over half the population of Gaza is under the age of 20. Around about a fifth, I think, of the population of Gaza is under the age of 4. To get proper drinking water, to make sure we don't have these electricity shortages, to get sanitation properly there, to repair the schools and so on. This should and can be done. And I found today from the Israeli Prime Minister a willingness, a genuine willingness, I think, to make sure that this happens.
What are the options open to the international community if Israel goes back on this and starts to impose further restrictions?
Well, I think it just creates a difficult situation always round. There is real pressure here on the government of Israel. It's just worth pointing this out, particularly because Gilad Shalit, who's the Israeli soldier that's been held captive now in Gaza he was kidnapped and held captive now for almost 4 years. He's not been allowed International Red Cross visits, or there's been no proper word of him and so forth. This is placing enormous pressure on the Israeli government. They're prepared, I think, to release very large numbers of Palestinian prisoners in exchange for his release. So it's important to understand that, when you're here in Israel, sometimes these things can look very, very different. But I think the Israeli government has a position now, which is a position of principle that it can justify. In other words, where our security is concerned, the government of Israel can say we're absolutely adamant that we will take no risks. But in respect of daily life and civilian life for people in Gaza, it's in nobody's interest that children can't get access to proper school materials, that people don't get proper drinking water and so on. So I think in respect of this now, if we implement it, we have the chance not just of changing policy in Gaza, but then using that to support the wider process. We're making progress on the West Bank. Economic growth is about 10% in the West Bank. The Palestinian Authority are making real steps forward towards statehood. If we can do this, carry on the improvement in the West Bank, and then turn the indirect proximity talks being led by Senator Mitchell at the moment into full-blown direct negotiations, we could actually, within a few months, put this thing properly on track.
Last week, the UN and the Palestinian Authority were saying that the blockade should be lifted in its entirety. Do you think that these detailed plans by Israel will now satisfy the UN and the PA?
Well, I think people will wait to see what actually happens. I think these principles will be generally welcomed. From Israel's point of view, they're not going to lift the blockade on combat material, weapons, or on checking things to make sure that type of material is not concealed with stuff going into Gaza. On the other hand, we have been calling for the last 2 years for a facilitation of construction projects, for this so-called permitted list to be changed into a prohibited list. That's now been agreed. So let's take this, as it were, at its face value, make sure that it's implemented, but if it is, it does give us the chance not just to change lives for people in Gaza, which is obviously the most important thing, but I think it would create a better context for the overall prospects for the peace process. If
Israel is true to its word and does this in good faith, what would you be looking for in return from the Palestinians?
Well, that's a good point, because I think, obviously, Palestinian politics is divided between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority. I think for the Palestinian Authority, we want them to carry on doing the work that's going on in the West Bank at the moment, which is superb, making a real difference to people's lives in the West Bank. And obviously, we would want, if the conditions are right, and I hope they can be, for direct talks to start over the two-state solution. That's what we want to see from the Palestinian Authority. From Hamas, they could make a huge gesture by releasing Gilad Shalit. And, I've constantly said it would be better if we have Hamas in this peace process rather than outside of it. To do that, they need to make it clear that they're prepared to pursue their objectives by peaceful and not by violent means. If we can do that and create a different atmosphere in and around not just the talks between the Palestinian Authority and the Israelis, but within the wider Palestinian politics, this would be all to the good. So, there are obligations on everybody here. But if we can use this as a stepping stone to create a better climate in and around the whole of this negotiation, that would be a great idea.
Middle East Envoy Tony Blair there, speaking to my colleague Martin Croxall a little earlier. Now the BBC